I want to welcome you all to this meeting. My name is Finn. I'm joining the meeting from Dublin. Myself, I'm the Vice President of Dublin Trades Council. We're hoping that this discussion is going to be very fruitful and very interesting. And we're hoping as many comrades as possible can contribute with their experiences in their own countries and more general theoretical points as well. Our main speaker, Themos Demetriou from Cyprus, will open the discussion, introducing the topic of the emergence of right-wing and fascist movements on a world scale. In several countries of Europe, there's a threat. Le Pen and her movement in France, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Vox in Spain, and an openly fascist organization, Golden Dawn, in Greece. There's also right-wing movements developing in Finland, in Sweden, and many other countries as well. Across the globe, we have right-wing regimes such as Modi in India, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. And of course, in the US, there's a proliferation of right-wing groups, like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. We saw a recent plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. So this question of the right wing on a world scale is an immediate and relevant and important topic for us all. So once again, I want to welcome Themos Demetriou and welcome his contribution on this vitally important topic. How much time would you think you want Themos to speak?
Well, I think it's a bit more than half an hour.
Half an hour then?
Yeah, I'll try to make it half an hour.
Okay, so I'll remind you after half an hour, I'll give you a wave and stuff.
Right.
Okay, Themos, so you can start.
Well, when Roger asked me to make a presentation, I was more thinking about a very specific issue that was very current at the time, and that was the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque by Erdogan. Now, this created a lot of discussion in Cyprus and from what I saw elsewhere in the world. And it was seen as a clash of civilizations, for Islam, Christianity, etc., etc. But Roger thought that we should broaden the matter and tackle the question of quasi-dictatorships like that of Erdogan around the world, because they do tend to proliferate these characters. And I shall try to do that, although I must say from the beginning that what I mostly researched was this Erdogan situation, and the rest is a bit more general. First of all, Hagia Sophia, I must explain that it's Hagia Sophia, not Saint Sophia. It's not a saint that was called Sophia, but it's the name it refers to the holy wisdom. Not that this is important, but I don't want to seem strange in using the word Hagia Sophia. And it's a monument that was built in the 6th century by Justinian, and he was very proud of it. He said that he beat Solomon at the temple building, and it was burned again and again in riots under the Byzantine Empire. And in 1453, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror conquered Constantinople and turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. And since then, it operated like a mosque until in 1934, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who secularized the Turkish state, turned Hagia Sophia into a museum. That was seen as a deepening of his secular approach and as an offer to the world for the sake of peace. In August 2020, this year, Erdogan turned this monument back into a mosque, and this was part of his reference to the ancient glories of the Ottoman Empire, and he was trying to reclaim that aura. As I said before, many see this as part of the revenge of the faithful, as a revenge for the suppression of religion under the Kemalist regime. This is something that is questionable because it's hard to think, it's hard to believe that Turkey, which was completely transformed by the Kemalist regime from a medieval empire really into a modern capitalist state. And there was this change was very deep. It wasn't just a superficial legal changeover, but really social change that transformed Turkey into a modern state, especially especially Western Turkey, like Istanbul and Izmir. They had nothing nothing that was lacking as far as modernity is concerned. Also, we must see that this really precludes the possibility of turning back to imperial times, and all this discussion that Erdogan is turning Turkey again into an empire, it's just completely misreading the real social situation in Turkey. And we also have to see that this attempt by Erdogan is not something that is different from his general policy. We can see that he's making all sorts of claims around the area. He invaded Syria. He sent mercenaries to Libya, and he's taking on Israel, the US, and Russia. I mean, it's a very serious claim that he's making. As I said, I don't think that it's possible for Turkey to return to Ottoman thinking. And we must understand that while he took power as an Islamist, a mild Islamist, as they say, his real slogans were against corruption, were about the development of Turkish capitalism, clearing the situation, helping the people, feeding the poor. So this is the sort of thing that most people miss, that it's not Islamism that got Erdogan to power, but it was something much different. As I said before, Erdogan is not the only semi-dictator that exists in the world. There are a lot of them all around. And as a general explanation of this, I'm not going to go into a deep analysis of this thing, but because I think it's a question of another discussion is the general world crisis of capitalism. And this crisis is not something, it's not one of the usual crises. We believe that the main reason for this is a long-term falling of the rate of profit and the transformation of capitalism from a productive system into a casino capitalism, where profit is not anymore the result of normal capitalist production, as Adam Smith described it, and Marx explained how it was developing. But it's a profit is what they call profit today is nothing more than financial swindlers who is going to steal from whom. And this is very important because it means that the stability of capitalism depends on the whims of the leaders that run the countries around the world, and especially the whims of the big companies and the big financial institutions that run the world. We are reaching a time when we can say that we are going beyond imperialism, in the sense that the capital has an international character, and this is in crisis. When this is in crisis all over the world, and we can see that only the political suppression of any revolt is the order of the day. So we see springing up these sort of leaders all around the world, and the revolution is just around the corner, really. I mean, we have seen it. We have seen how easy things can go into revolutionary mode if we see what happened in the advanced capitalist countries, not the very advanced also. We have seen this happening in the Arab Spring. We have seen this happening in Athens in '65, in 2015, not 65, in 2015, when the Syriza took power, and for 6 months they took on the world, and the world tried to suppress them and defeated them in the end. We have seen this in America with Bernie Sanders coming out of nowhere and speaking of socialism in a country where socialism was a taboo word, and he just failed to win the nomination and lost to Hillary Clinton because, again, the establishment threw everything it could against him. So this in Britain with Jeremy Corbyn, again, coming within a whisker of taking power, and again he was vilified and attacked by the establishment in a concerted way that led to his downfall last year. I said in many articles in the past that we are living in a situation where reform and revolution are not much different these days. And the reason is that capitalism cannot afford any reforms. And any reform that is being attempted seriously, it sparks off revolutionary movements. It doesn't mean that reforms by themselves are going to overcome capitalism. There is a fallacy that many of the reformists trying to do this take with them. But certainly what they don't realize, these reformists, is that by being true to their own beliefs, they are sparking revolutions everywhere. I call this modern radicalism. modest radicalism, in the sense that even modest radical demands spark off revolutions. And of course, if these attempts fail, we see people like Trump and Boris Johnson and other far-right leaders coming up and trying to take or even taking power. We've seen this also in a somewhat different form in the quasi-dictators of Latin America, Bolsonaro and Sebastián Piñera, who have seen how they hijacked the democratic process to suppress anything, any opposition attempt, and we've seen the attempt to take over power in Venezuela and against Morales, and we've seen against Maduro, and we've seen also the attempt and the overthrow of Morales when it was a very clearly American intervention and American coup that happened. Of course, they lost in both cases because the people managed to keep the power, to keep power in these countries. But of course, even there, we don't see how these countries can survive unless a more general world revolution develops. More sinister forms of these dictatorships we see in Putin's Russia, who in fact is probably one of the most he's one of the most pure Bonapartes of modern age. And he's really overseeing the establishment of Russian capitalism. They say establishment of Russian capitalism, not restoration, because there was not really any capitalism before the Russian Revolution in 1917. This capitalism is being built on the wealth that was amassed by the Soviet Union during the years of the kind of socialism that existed in Russia. And we can see also Erdogan as a Bonaparte because he's creating the conditions for the development of Turkish capitalism. We can see this in the light of the 18th Brumaire, and that's interesting. And we shall see Marx at his best in this work. And I want to read this piece here because I think it's important. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Consider for Danton, Louis Blanc, for Robespierre, the Montagne of 48 to 51 for the Montagne of 1793 to 1795, the nephew for the uncle. And the same caricature occurs in the circumstances of the second edition of the 18th Brumaire. Here he compares the revolution, the real revolution that established French capitalism, with the revolutions of 48, which was defeated, and it was trying to copy what happened in the real revolution. And he considers the first as a tragedy in the sense that it was a huge event, and the second is farce, which really didn't change anything. As an aside, I must remind that these phrases here are not really Marxist. It's not Marx who put them down. It was Engels who wrote this in a letter to Marx at about that time. Nobody remembers that, but it's important to see how these people worked together then. He explains how this works, that in a revolution, people try to build something new. They don't know how to do it. They don't know what they are after. They don't realize that what they are doing is putting the power in the hands of a new class. And in such epochs, they tend to look to the past to find some examples and to give some poetic glory to what they are doing. And in 1789, they did this in a grand scale. They wanted to give glory to their struggles. In 48, they just tried to imitate the revolution. Thus, Luther donned the mask of Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1780 to 1814 draped itself alternately as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than parody now 1789, now the revolutionary traditions of 1793 to 95. So he makes this distinction, and he explains that it's a question of what was the class balance at each time. In 1789, they were replacing the class rule from one class to the other. The bourgeoisie was taking over. In 1848, the bourgeoisie was stable. It was not interested in revolutions, so it was trying to control the revolution and control the situation, and it was no longer interested in fighting for the ideas of the revolution of 1789. So Marx continues and says that from 1848 to 1851, only the cost of the old revolution circulated. A whole nation, which thought it had acquired an accelerated power of motion by means of a revolution, suddenly finds itself set back into a defunct epoch. The social revolution of the 19th century cannot take its poetry from the past, but only from the future. What he's saying here is that the bourgeois revolution looked to the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire to aggrandize its work, to feel that they were doing something new. The proletarian revolution cannot do that. It cannot look back. It has to look to the future. It has to look what can be done, what socialism is, and where it should move itself. So this radical distinction that Marx makes between the one revolution and the other, and this, as we can see, can apply to most revolutions that we have seen there. One of such revolution was the Greek Revolution of 1821. There, Rigas Ferreos, one of the theorists of the revolution before the revolution, took his inspiration from the French Revolution, and his vision was a huge country that would embrace all the nationalities of the Balkans and the Asia Minor, and take up the ideals of the French Revolution and move forward. The poetry of the revolution, both Rigas Fereos and the rest of the Greek revolutionaries, saw into the glories of ancient Greece. Of course, this was not really the idea of the locals, of the local Greeks. It was mostly the idea of the Philhellenes, the Western intellectuals who sided with the revolution, and the Greek diaspora. This is the picture on the left is the cover of a map of Greece that Rigas Fereos dreamed, and it's full of pictures of ancient Greek works of art. And also, to this picture of ancient Greece, the church at some stage managed to introduce its own mythology of what had happened, although it was completely hostile to the revolution. It managed to present itself as the instigator and the leader once the revolution succeeded. So the poetry of the revolution was the Greco-Christian ideals, which was used as the foundation of the Greek bourgeois state. Of course, the Greek capitalism was much weaker than anything in the West. The revolution was almost defeated until the navies of the three great powers defeated the Ottoman navy in Navarino and offered Greece independence. So it was a dependent nation, and dependent on the great powers, and as a proof of that, they imposed a Bavarian king, Otto, a youngster in his early 20s, to rule Greece. And this dependence led to a long drawn-out stabilization of the Greek state. It was completely unstable, completely dependent on foreign aid. Its parties were called, most of its parties were called the British Party, the Russian Party, the French Party, the German Party. So it wasn't really an independent state. And you can see that the various colors show the expansion of the Greek state from the deep blue, which was the original Greek state, to the rest. And at some stage, the yellows were areas where Greece hoped to annex, and with the help of the West, they had troops there. But then Kemal Atatürk managed to overthrow the Ottoman Sultan and defeat the Greeks and establish Turkey.
Themos, I'm sorry to interrupt you here. You have about 5 minutes more or thereabouts, if you bear that in mind.
Well, I'll try to do my best.
Yeah.
This took from 1821, that was the revolution. It took until the end of the Second World War before it stabilized a Greek state. And in 1967, the Colonel's coup was a result of this unstable situation. And again, the colonels turned to tend to classical Greek iconography to aggrandize their result. The result was a very kitsch replication of ancient battles, which was really the farce phase of this revolution. I shall leave out the Russian Revolution because I don't have time. And I shall come to the Kemalist Revolution, which was very important, although it didn't really overthrow the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire simply collapsed. Mustafa Kemal picked up the pieces and tried to build a new state, taking his poetry not from the past, not from the future, but from the West. He tried to establish the Western country. He built the new nation state, Turkey. He secularized society. He banned polygamy and religious headgear. He gave women the vote and equality, and introduced the Western alphabet in place of the old Ottoman script. He created the conditions for the development of Turkish capitalism. In this creation, the army was his instrument, and this was both the strength and the weakness of the Kemalist revolution. With the army in full control, there were no ways of, there were no checks and balances. There was no control of what was happening. The result was the proliferation of corruption to such an extent that it was, by the time Erdogan came into the picture, it was ready to collapse. Even the organized crime was part of this state corruption that was being hated by the people. Erdogan, in 1997, he spoke also. He spoke of poetry, with poetry to his way to power. At a rally, he referenced a poem saying that the mosques are our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets our bayonets, and the believers our soldiers. This was considered enough of an insult to the secular state that he was put in jail. But he continued his campaign and he managed to come to power, not as an Islamist leader really, although this was the way he was speaking, but mainly because he promised the Turkish people that he would see that they were fed, to see that they were taken care of, and that he would see that corruption would be eliminated. And this continued. He managed to really transform Turkey from what was happening in up to a point until the coup of 2016. There was an attempt to overthrow him. It was the first televised coup in the history of the world. We could see it from the very start on our screens, and it was defeated. And the defeat gave Erdogan the starting point for the imposition of his dictatorship. He got rid of Fethullah Gülen, which was the main Islamist power behind his rule, and his collaborator up to then, which shows how little Islam has to do with Erdogan's power. He got rid eventually of Abdullah Gül and Ahmed Davutoğlu, the more intellectual of his team, and he started a witch hunt of the army, of the universities, and of the intelligentsia in general in Turkey, and he started his military adventures. At that time, he was starting to base himself and base his support among the people on the pictures of ancient grandeur of the empire. He built a huge palace. He saw himself as the leader of Islam around the area, but from the attempt to have zero problems with his neighbors, he managed to have conflict with each and every one of them.
Themos, would you start drawing your remarks towards perhaps a conclusion?
Well, Erdogan has his limits. Turkish capitalism cannot really survive in the new world. The invasion of Syria, Libya, and now his blue fatherland is claiming almost something that cannot be given by Greece and Cyprus. And a simple comment on the reaction of the world towards Hagia Sophia. They have been reacting to it as if it was a cultural thing, not political. What we must understand is that opposing Erdogan means opposing Turkish capitalism, and opposing Turkish imperialism means opposing world capitalism. One last thing, why is history repeating itself, and why twice? We have to understand that Marx is not saying that it does. What he insists is that to understand political and social phenomena, we must look at the class context in which they take place. So we should not see this as a prediction that history will repeat itself twice, once as tragedy and the other as farce. But we should see it as an analysis of events in the context of the class balance that we live in. And we can find that it repeated itself as farce in every situation, almost, not once, but mostly 2 or 3 or even 4 times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Themos. It's a very interesting contribution, and it gives the comrades lots of things to think about. Themos dwelt obviously with Erdogan. There's lots of similar regimes in Europe, with Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on. So comrades are free to speak. If they indicate on the electronic system here, I'll call them in. So I have one indication. Leslie, unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thanks.
You're on.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Themos. A question, and then well, 2 questions and a couple of comments. I think it's quite uplifting, the decision in the law courts in Greece against Golden Dawn. I'd be quite interested to know sort of the reflection of their strength on the you know, on the ground, and what effect that decision has had, and to what extent that decision is a reflection of a move away from
I cannot. There is something wrong with the sound.
A second question is for the American comrades regarding QAnon and the far, you know, that element, the far right in America, about how the American comrades have
Leslie, there's a problem with your connection.
Oh,
The sound is very,
can you hear me?
we can hear you, but the sound is distorted. There's an electronic distortion.
Sorry, can you hear me?
We can hear you all right, but your voice is being
Is it
distorted.
my internet connection?
Leslie, turn your picture, turn your video off. It might be a bit better.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but it's unclear.
Then can you hear me?
Yes, that's better. Try again.
Oh, right. Yeah. Is that any better?
That's a bit better, Leslie. Yeah, go on.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, that's better.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh,
All
okay.
there was a Liverpool accent.
Shall I type? Yeah, I'll turn the video off and see if that improves it. So try this. Yeah. Is that any better?
It is better, Leslie. Continue there, yeah.
Still not clear.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay, is that any better without the video?
Yes.
Is it any better?
Yes. Yeah.
Shall I just write the questions?
No, we can hear you now, Leslie.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if Themos had the. So the first question was for Themos, really, about the decision over Golden Dawn in Greece. Is that? Can you hear me now? Yeah.
No, I can,
Okay. And the second question was about to the US comrades about QAnon. Okay. And I just wanted to make a comment about QAnon and that element of the far right have begun to get, you know, it's a toehold, but they are actually beginning. Is it very bad? Shall I just write me points in the chat, Finn?
Okay, Leslie. I mean, it's
Finn?
clear. Yeah, yeah. So you can do that.
Shall I just write up in the chat?
Yeah, so we got your general points. Themos,
Yeah.
you heard that Leslie is asking about Golden Dawn.
Finn, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you
No.
clearly,
Oh,
Leslie.
I'll write up in the chat. Okay.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I'll put it in the chat because.
Okay, okay, that's fine. So, Themos, the question was about Golden Dawn and the recent defeat which you suffered at the hand of the courts in Greece. And the
Okay.
second question was directed towards the US
So
government.
I just wanted to. Yeah, I just was making the point about. Is that okay? Yeah.
Well,
Okay, Themos, you're on again.
about Golden Dawn. Well, Golden Dawn was really a result of the extreme austerity that was imposed in Greece back in 2012, really, and it gained a lot of support with an anti-immigrant Nazi approach. But at some stage, the main conservative party managed to attract some of its supporters and decided that they had to distance themselves from the more extreme slogans. And they decided to arrest them. And they arrested them back in, it's a few years now. I think 2014, I think, something like that. And but at that time they had a strong presence in parliament, and the trial dragged on. It started after the murder of a protest singer. And today they were convicted. These days were convicted. But I think that we should not think that it's the whole thing has just passed away. Most of the slogans of Golden Dawn were adopted by New Democracy in a softer vein. And also their conviction was made possible because of huge public response. There were thousands and thousands of demonstrators outside the court when the decision was going to be taken. So it shows that that public opinion really matters. And if people are ready to come out, they can make a change.
Thank you. Thanks, Themos. Leslie also had a question directed at the US comrades about the right wing in the US, in particular the QAnon conspiracy theorists. But in the meantime, anybody who wants to speak, just well, you can wave at me, or you can enter the electronic system. There's nobody on the electronic system wanting to speak. It's very unusual for a WIN meeting, actually. Yeah, Roger. Roger, unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
I wanted to, I think Themos gave a very good background to the discussion. There is a fashionable theory going around, which is describing all these new regimes around the world as the phrase is creeping fascism. And it's true that the regimes of Erdogan and of Orban, Bolsonaro, Modi, Duterte, Putin, etc., they're ruthlessly authoritarian, and they exploit poisonous prejudices and racism in a kind of grotesque parody, if you like, of fascism. But while I think the comparison ends there, because while it's right to draw attention to the demolition of democratic rights in these countries, it's not the same as the fascist counter-revolutions of the past, like in, say, Italy, Germany, and Spain, which wiped out a generation of working-class fighters and established regimes of unspeakable tyranny. And fascism was a particular acute variant of reaction based on a mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie, as Trotsky explained, crazed by economic ruin and finding themselves hopelessly squeezed between what they saw as two pitiless forces, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It was only because it rested on a vast mass base that it was able to establish regimes that slaughtered and enslaved millions and lasted years and sometimes decades. Now, since then, in the advanced metropolitan countries, there have been fundamental changes in the class composition of society. On one side, the solid industrial communities in which workers were concentrated together in their thousands, working on production lines in factories or shipyards or steelworks or digging coal, they're a dying force in most of those countries. Manufacturing has been largely transplanted to new terrain. But at the same time, the wealth and capital are concentrated into the hands of a tiny handful of plutocrats. So there's no longer a broad intermediate class either. The old so-called petty bourgeoisie has been squeezed out, driven out of business, stripped of any former trappings of status, stampeded into the ranks of the new working class, stretching from what were formerly marginally privileged so-called white-collar workers to the new so-called precariat, or both simultaneously. This new working class may be harder to organize, slower to move, but it's no less proletarian, and it's rapidly learning. And that's why we're now seeing strikes of teachers, university lecturers, junior hospital doctors, and also of office cleaners, delivery couriers, fast food catering workers, and so on. Now, if I may, I want to just say, what about those countries where there still is a large non-proletarian population? there too, as in Europe and North America, right-wing parties have been sweeping to power due to disillusion with the corruption and hypocrisy of the old liberal parties. But are they a stable mass base for a fascist regime? If I could have just 2 or 3 minutes to give the example of India, because there's no problem in calling Modi, like many of the others individually, as fascists, but that's very different from saying that India has become a fascist state, whether creeping or fully fledged or of any other kind. It's mobilized, he has mobilized a broad base of popular support, but it's passive and tentative. It's not like there are armies of street thugs like those that violently swept Hitler and Mussolini to power, or of course the Franco. All these regimes came to power by constitutional means. Every one of these so-called creeping fascist regimes all actually came to power by election. Now, if we take India, Modi personally had blood on his hands from his time as Chief Minister of Gujarat, where he oversaw a massacre of Muslims. And since coming to power, naturally, he's applied brutal policies, racist and communal attacks on Muslims and other minorities, the rounding up and internment of huge numbers of the Muslim population living for decades on the borders of Bangladesh, and perhaps most graphically of all, an overnight coup abolishing Kashmir's statehood and autonomous status, cutting all its communication links, flooding it with occupation troops, a coup almost comparable to Hitler's annexation of Austria or Czechoslovakia. And Modi's political vehicle, the BJP, is an explicitly communal Hindu outfit and the political voice of a conglomerate of sinister forces, including the VHP, the Hindu communal movement, which provoked conflict throughout India in 1992 by mobilizing 150,000 thugs to storm a mosque, the Babri Masjid Mosque at Ayodhya. It's also the Shiv Sena, an overtly fascist party, consciously modeled on the Nazis, explicitly so, which organized a massacre of 3,000 Muslims in Mumbai in the early 90s in a pre-planned act of ethnic cleansing. And the RSS, a paramilitary Hindu mass movement of which Modi is a lifelong member. It has 5 to 6 million members and over 1 million organized volunteers who hold regular public paramilitary drills. It was actually founded, it openly praised Mussolini and Hitler. It was an RSS member who assassinated Gandhi in 1948. Having said that, Modi has at the same time enraged precisely that mass base which might otherwise have been a source of support, with his ending of subsidies, his demolition of the last remaining vestiges of state regulation, and above all, the brutal policy that he introduced in overnight demonetization of banknotes, which represented 85% of all currency in circulation. It was banknotes worth as little as £5, like £5 notes and £10 notes were suddenly worthless. A policy which hit mostly, of course, not the money launderers, as he claimed, but it hit the small traders, and it's hardly a policy designed to appease the middle class. So just finally, there is another India. Fascism means, if it means anything, it means the complete pulverization of the working class. And the Indian working class remains a vast, politically untapped and potentially invisible force. It's not remained silent. In the 2 biggest general strikes in world history, in September 2016, and then again on the 8th and 9th of January 2019, 200 million workers in India went on strike and marched and rallied throughout the length and breadth of the subcontinent. It gripped every part of India, from the industrial metropoli of Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, Kolkata, reaching from Kashmir to Kerala, from Gujarat to Assam, and stretching even to the offshore islands and the remote tribal areas. It encompassed workers in the public sector, transport, manufacturing, mining, education, banking, insurance, communications, agriculture, construction, the tea plantations, every nook and cranny, you could say, of the labour force. It even drew in kiosk traders, street vendors, auto rickshaw drivers, beady rollers, domestic, casual and home-based workers. Women's participation was actually the most graphically new element in the situation. They were in the forefront of every movement. This was like a colossal tsunami of struggle which swept through a country. This was 200 million workers, where there are only 30 million organized trade union members. So, and actually, believe it or not, since 1 in 6 people in the world live in India, and at least 1 in 9 of these were on strike, this gigantic mass movement actually involved 1 in every 50 inhabitants on the planet. So all those who are already wringing their hands and mourning the advent of creeping fascism are only seeing one side of the equation. The last word has yet to be spoken in India and worldwide. And the working class is by no means crushed, even in India, let alone the other countries that are in this category. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. A very valuable illustration of the differences between the fascist regimes of the past, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and the right-wing regimes that are now percolating across the globe. Very useful contribution. Thank you, Roger. The next speaker is Ed.
Thank you, Finn, and thank you very much for your introduction, Themos, which has certainly helped me understand better what's going on in Turkey. I just want to say a few words about Poland and Hungary in regard to this question of far-right regimes. In Poland, and it's probably been in the press in most countries, there's a growing state-sponsored intolerance towards the LGBT community that's eagerly supported by the church, the Catholic Church, and it's creating. I mean, it's a classic example of a regime that is finding it difficult to control the population, creating divisions and creating distractions in order to try and bolster up its position in society. I mean, there are under local government laws, there are towns in Germany where intolerance towards gays is written into the law. Things like same-sex marriage is it's illegal in in Poland, and violence towards gays has increased on the streets and so on. And there have been LGBT demos which have been violently attacked by far-right thugs and so on. Many gays in Poland hide their sexuality because of this fear. At the same time, and again combined the government with the Catholic Church, there's a huge intolerance towards any form of abortion. With prior to COVID, with thousands of women looking for ways to get out of Poland if they needed abortions, and of course with COVID and the reduction in the mobility of the population, those women, when they need abortions, looking for them in sort of unofficial and therefore much more dangerous providers. And incidentally, in many other respects, Poland has got one of the best health services in Europe, which is a heritage from many years ago. There's a fight back against this as well. There was a big demonstration on Friday. There was a big demonstration of women, mainly young women, protesting about the anti-abortion laws. You have a classic situation where many progressive young people in Poland, with the entry into the EU, migrated west to get better paid jobs in Britain and other Western European countries, sending remittances home. But the Polish economy has boomed over the last 20 or 30 years. But the inequality in Polish society has greatly increased, and large numbers of children live in poverty, and a large number of young people who are in Poland take precarious jobs, very low paid jobs, jobs below the minimum wage. There's been an influx of workers from the Ukraine into Poland who've taken some of the jobs that Polish workers have left behind when they migrated, and the population of Poland is getting more and more elderly. This is the background in which this government of the Law and Justice Party has not had a stable ride. It came into office in the in the middle of the first decade of this century, was ousted, and then came back into office. It's not had a stable ride. And one of the big obstacles that is facing this government is the mine workers union. In Poland, there are some 90,000 mine workers and a whole load of associated industries in the south of Poland, in Silesia, Śląsk, as the Poles call it. They are the unionization in Poland is 12% of the workforce. In the mining industry, unionization is 100%. The government, with its neoliberal agenda, wants to actually close down the mining industry. It's under the guise of the green agenda, but there's no plan to redeploy mine workers and mining communities into the skills required to develop green energy. It's a complete neoliberal approach to making mine workers redundant. And these are communities that, in the same way as the people of the Amazon feel completely stolen of their entire community when forest is chopped down. If you destroy a mine, then the entire community around it collapses, unless you have planning in the economy that allows those mine workers to be redeployed and their community to retain its cohesion and so on. And the strength of the mine workers union in Poland is a huge obstacle to the government's neoliberal agenda. They've had to make concessions, improve the wages of miners. They've now delayed the closure of the mine working industry until 2049 because they are unable to get round the power of the mine workers union. Now, if you turn to Hungary, there's a similar, it's not the same story, but it's a similar story that you've had with the entry of Hungary into the EU, you've had a migration west of many young people from Hungary, and Hungary, which is quite an industrial country, with Orban's actually in power since 2010, promoting the cheap labour force that there is in Hungary in order to attract foreign investors into Hungary, with the automotive industry, Tesco's, Spar, all moving into Hungary to set up production and to try and take advantage of cheap labour. But with young people moving out of Hungary to Western Europe and big companies moving into Hungary to take advantage of the cheap labour force, it's no surprise that workers have found that they have industrial strength, and there's been huge strikes against the government. In fact, the Hungarian workers nicknamed 2019 as the year of the strike because they put so much pressure on the government through their strike movement. Steel workers are protesting because their contracts were suspended in August and their wages have been delayed. And it's in this situation that the government in Hungary has just begun to introduce anti-gay rhetoric into its propaganda, because they are looking for ways to divide the population. So these are regimes attempting to implement right-wing policies, but they have underneath them, they have a boiling cauldron of workers' power and discontented young people who are not going to accept it lightly. That's it.
Thank you, Ed. David Hampson, you're next.
Thanks, Themos, for your really useful input. And, you know, I hope in coming in that we'll see others also, you know, coming in and contributing. You know, I just want to deal, first of all, well, maybe three big points. First of all, to deal with, you know, the rise of populist movements and re-establishment of neo-fascist groups and the like. And what we can see in the period, particularly after the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, is the enormous acceleration of these movements. We've seen a leftward movement, but actually, if we look back on the last decade, really the big phenomenon has been of right-wing movements. And now we're seeing again the re-emergence of the left. But let's just look at this side of it first. And what we see on the right, and it's exemplified by what's happened there in Golden Dawn and the rest, is that in society there are these latent groups, not really going anywhere, but looking for the opportunity. The right-wing movements, as someone who's written on them recently has said, are going through constant mutation, finding something doesn't work and then reworking it until they find what works. In the case of Golden Dawn, the murdering of people in the labor movement, of resistors, of protesters and all the rest of it, created a kind of elan, a kind of we can't go wrong sense. And of course, that was the coronal idea of fascism, and it's exemplified also in the statement that we've had in the introduction to this meeting. But we find that this is not the only phenomenon. We've seen Erdogan, you know, rising in the current period in a most extraordinary development in society, where Turkey has turned away from Eurocentralism, in other words, orientation to Europe and even the EU, towards fighting to keep a completely independent position and undertaking adventure after adventure, as we've seen in Libya and elsewhere, extremely dangerous to the ruling class, economically disastrous at different points, but actually determined, maintaining a certain base in society, and I'd like to deal with, you know, just how that's happening. And I think if we look at the movement I've touched on from below, but if we look at it from above, what we see is that the ruling class is trying to reconstitute itself. In some ways we can see, yes, it's this faction or that faction coming to power, but actually generally what we're looking at is a reconstruction of the elites. When they're faced with the challenge of a recession and now a depression, they're looking to and fro for more decisive, more forceful leadership, which can somehow break the existing conventions, head towards a more decisive state intervention, and hopefully then crush the working class, or at least push the working class back in different ways. And of course, then they, as we see with Trump and also in Erdogan, they're very determined to recreate a populist or even a neo-fascist group from below, you know, to give them the, you know, their support. The second point I wanted to make is that it relates to the nation state, the party, the ruling party and the nation state. Now, a lot has been said about the demise of the nation state. What we see in the current period is actually the recreation, the regeneration of the nation state in its most vicious way, with border controls popping up, you know, throughout Europe. We saw that in recent months, the EU has even put up borders against itself. Now we see the borders celebrated in the States, and we see that also now implicit there with immigrants coming through to Greece and finding that they can't get any further into Europe. In other words, the nation state is in its most elemental way, the armed bodies of men, there they are now being staked out, across the border and facing those who are daring to resist from internally, as we see in Nigeria. I don't know if you saw that video. It's the most extraordinary sight to see troops just walking in randomly and then just aiming their rifles at people and just killing them without any compunction. Totally unexpected. And this is what these states are preparing. But they're also, the leader is then recreating the party. We've seen that the Republican Party is a totally different instrument from what it was in the past. And I think Erdogan is actually doing this as well. He's cleaning out the state. I think we've seen hundreds of thousands of teachers and civil servants being dismissed. It's unbelievable, what is taking place in the recreation or the destruction of elements of the old state and the reconstruction of elements of the new state. I'm sure there's a huge security apparatus which is now being developed at the same time. And we see this taking place to some extent now in Latin America, and I just want to touch on what's happening now in Brazil. We should remember that Trotsky, in writing about fascism, we're not talking directly about fascism, but we're looking at this right-wing phenomenon, or mentioned that this is precipitated and accelerated by defeats on the left and a weak leadership. And I've been watching a video which gives graphic illustration of what's happened in the Workers' Party in Brazil. And just remember, at one time, and it was only about 18 months ago, a little bit longer, the Workers' Party in Brazil had a popularity which was just short of 80%. 80% popularity. And in the period which followed, before Bolsonaro took over, it slid further and further down until it really got down to the low 30s. Can you imagine that huge political change, even while the economic issues were not accelerating quite at the same pace? And we've seen the Workers' Party and other parties in Europe being discredited in the eyes of their own members, that they are utterly corrupt. In this case of Workers' Party in Brazil, I was astonished to see just the extent to which they had also participated in the bribery and the corruption of the past. What they were doing was relying on large companies to pay for their electoral expenses. And we know elections are incredibly expensive if you're using all the media. And the Workers' Party was doing that, but then extending contracts to certain companies who were then giving them kickbacks to get them re-elected. Now, of course, the right-wing parties were doing that too, but it did enormously weaken the Workers' Party in the eyes of the members. You could see how despondent they were, after the last election. I mean, it fell apart, virtually at that time. And it's only in this context of a weakening of the political instruments of this political attitudes, the solidarity among the working class, at least for a period, which has given the right wing this advantage from below and from above to move in these different ways. In America, we see only 10% of the working class is organized in trade unions. You could imagine the opportunity there are for all kinds of developments in the working class, which are like this QAnon and other elements, which are able to put forward ideas which are deeply irrational, develop them further, accelerate them through social media, and create enough confusion among working class people to be able to not know whether they should be voting one way or the other or not vote at all. And in that political confusion is the opportunity for the right wing from above to be able to take advantage. I'm not quite sure what the situation in Turkey is. I'd be interested to hear from about that, Themos, and your response in the end, and to understand just what is from below. But we do know that in Turkey there was an enormous left-wing movement. I remember watching, was listening to the BBC, and at a mass meeting of workers, which was addressed by some right-wing person, the response from the students was to sing the International and to drown him out. Now imagine that spirit. That was there in Turkey, and now that's being stamped on and abused. Now, what is the future for these regimes? We can see that for a period, they can come to the top. They can even get 80%. Bolsonaro, for instance, is rising in popularity. It's not as though he's crashing with the COVID. And what is happening is they're using the same methods in the sense of social democracy as fascism tried as well. I'm not talking about genuine social democracy, but the reformism of Workers' Party. They're extending cash grants to workers and to be able to get some base of popularity. It's reckless, they can't do it forever, but that's what they're doing. But can they solve the problem of capitalism in each national element and to be able to bring people back into full employment and the like? They can't. And that is the outlook for these regimes, is that as we'll see in Britain, and I imagine that's what we're going to see in Turkey, and certainly what we're going to see in Brazil, as Trump falls, or he wavers, or there's an undercutting of the support, there will be a weakening of these regimes throughout the world, and they will move in the same way. Someone I heard the other day was talking about the domino effect on right-wing regimes. Once one goes, then the whole lot is actually tripping over itself and ready to fall. So I think we can look forward with some optimism to see the rising movements from below, the explosions that we've seen in Costa Rica, in Nigeria, in other countries where we are almost unable to keep up with it at the moment. That this is the pressure from below. These regimes are unable to solve the problems from capitalism despite the despotism in which they are exercising. They are recreating parties which are going to fall apart. I think Roger alluded to this. These right-wing parties that they've set in their own image are actually going to crumble. There's not a single principle holding them together, except that they're following a leader. That's what they are doing. So that it's the Boris party, really is what we see in the conservatives. And it's the same in Bolsonaro, which has got a much weaker political structure. And these political structures will actually, be tested and fall apart. And there's the opening. There, the right wing has disgraced itself, and the working class will be coming back on its feet and able to then take power. Thank you.
Thank you, David. This is a very valuable point about the failure of the leaders of the labour movement to move forward, which gives opportunities to the right to exploit the situation and build their own strength. The next speaker is John Ryman.
So I'd like to make one point about US history. And I was reading an article in Al Jazeera, I just posted on my Facebook page, about lynchings in the South back in the early part of the last century. And I mean, it's absolutely horrific. And that article describes how hundreds and in fact thousands of people, just ordinary people, participated in these lynchings. And I mean, part of it wasn't just the lynchings themselves, but then they brought their children to quote, enjoy it. And then they would go back and take home a souvenir of a little piece of bloody rope or a bloody piece of the shirt or something like that. And these were just ordinary people. And you just have to wonder what kind of horrific sickness was seething underneath the surface, and in some cases not underneath the surface. And in the South, in the white population of the South for all those years. And then when lynching became no longer possible, what they did was the state stepped in and had public executions. So it gave it the respectability of law. And don't forget that in the North, all of this was tolerated for years and years and years. in the United States. And this is, in some ways, this tradition of violence and bloodshed is what the different militia, they're not really militias, they're vigilante groups that are now developing. It is those traditions that they are building themselves on, even though some of them, say that they're not racist and even have some Black members in it, but it's still those traditions. Now, there's a lot of people in the United States now on the left who say, oh, this is a fascist country, or it's about to become fascism. And that's completely wrong. It's not about to become fascist. But, and I don't want to be misinterpreted about this, but what Trump is moving to do is to seize one-person control of the government. That's what he is trying to do. And you can see that in how he has moved to take control of one agency after another. And there's a resistance being put up by the capitalist class or the mainstream of the capitalist class against this. And it's not clear, but it's, or I would say not and, but it's not clear which way that that struggle will end up, especially given the, when you consider the outcome of the coming election. Now, the previous speaker said, as Donald Trump falls. Now, I think that it is more likely than not that that Biden will replace him. But I think that it is by no means certain. And I've been following the polls, which I think are a lot more accurate than a lot of people give them credit for. I've been following the polls very, very closely. And you see now, none of the polls in any of the states matter except for a few of the key battleground states. And Trump is narrowing the gap. He's still significantly behind, but he's narrowing the gap there by marginally. And if he can get it close enough, then with all the voter suppression and other shenanigans and the use of the Supreme Court that he's gonna take advantage of, I think that, as I said, I think more likely than not, Biden will be the next president, but it is definitely not certain that that will be the case. Now, and I'd like to raise that in relation to this issue of the demise of the nation state. And we as Marxists, when we hear that term, we think of the state. In other words, the government power. But the article which I have referred to quite a few times, it wasn't written by a Marxist, and that was not how the author of that article, that was not how the author of that article meant it. And Donald Trump himself, in a sense, gives recognition to what that author was talking about. He said numerous times, if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. And in that sense, he's right. And what has happened is that the borders over several decades have been progressively weakened. Capital is flooding from one country to another just with the push of a computer button. And not only that, but populations have been flooding from one part of the world to another. And workers see that in conjunction with the fall in their own living standards, not because of the mass immigration, but because of the crisis in capitalism. But that's not what's being put before them. And also, there has been a decline in class consciousness. And so hundreds of millions of workers all around the world, they yearn for a return to their country, or what that author wrote, referred to as their nation state. They yearn for a return to that. And that is what I think a lot of these dictators, including the would-be fascist dictators, that is what they base themselves on. And just my one last point is that given that, I think that really raising the banner of internationalism and international struggles and cross-border regional struggles of workers is more important than ever at this time. And any time that we are launching any kind of broader political initiative, that I think that we cannot fail to raise that, because unless that is the only way that I can see to combat this increased nationalism and increased chauvinism that we are seeing, and communalism that we are seeing all around the world. Not to call for international struggles in the abstract, but actually to explain how workers in one country can and must link up with workers in other countries to fight for minimum standard of living, minimal social benefits, environmental regulations, and so on. And I think that that has to be a central element in our fight against communalism and fascism and chauvinism.
Thank you, John. It's a very valuable point about the international struggles. The working class is of necessity international, and it's very important to recognize that and to make our struggles, to aim them at workers throughout the world. We should also note that the right wing have been defeated as well, like Vox in Spain has lost its base. And in Chile, there's a referendum today, I think, a referendum to drive out Pinochet's constitution because of the mass involvement in opposing that. So there are victories as well. The right wing don't have it all their own way. No. Oh, Antula Papadopoulou. Antula
Hello,
Papadopoulou.
everybody.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I can't use the camera. Something wrong with my computer. I would like to add to what everybody has said. Thank you very much, Themo, for providing such a good framework to discuss these important issues. I would like to remind us all that in the reconstruction of the elite, to use a phrase of David Henson's, I would like to remind us that in this process, in the reconstruction, the elite are actually using every single thing that they can and are able to use and to exploit, especially in relation to introducing more reactionary and more more reactionary elements in their ruling, apart from the LGBT community. They're of course using migrants and refugees. This large part of invisible, highly exploited, marginalized part of the working class of Western societies, and not only. So in its latest new pact on migration asylum, the European Union actually reiterated its ever-growing assault on this vulnerable community in European societies. And of course, Britain is not excluded. Let me just remind you of Johnson's and his Interior Secretary have actually done in relation to migrants coming into Britain from France, and how inhumanely they have treated those people, and how they have tried to stop them from coming into Britain. In in using an ever-growing racist rhetoric, what the governments, and it's not only the Hungarian government or the Polish government, or it happens in every European country, and of course the US as well, with Trump being clearly a neo-fascist as far as I'm concerned. They are actually using extreme right neo-fascist, neo-Nazi party narrative. And in this way, not only do they excuse and validate or justify their policies against migrants and the Black community and other ethnic minorities, but also they are appealing to their citizens, white citizens in the United States, and their citizens in other countries, again white in their greatest majority, so that they can feed into the conflict and the popular discontent, and thereby maintain their position in government and in society in general.
Thank you.
So I don't know what the left can actually do about including migrants and refugees in its agenda. We have to be aware and introduce whatever measures we can in order to include migrants and refugees who are, as I said before, the most vulnerable and the most invisible part of the working class. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rantula. Now, we'd like to end the meeting at 9 o'clock. Now, the Themos has provided a very valuable and informative introduction, so give Themos a chance to summarize. I also want to thank those people for whom English is not their first language, for their contributions each week to these discussions. We should need to thank them for that effort which they make, and everything they say is completely understandable. So it takes a bit of work to do that, and we're grateful for that. Now, as I say, we'd like to finish at 9, so if there's nobody else on my list here, but if there is a comment who wants to speak, could they indicate? They can just start waving at the microphone at this stage. And if not, we'll go to Themos, who might want to take up some of the themes that were developed, or maybe answer some specific questions. So is there anybody else who wants to speak at this stage? Okay, Themos, you can make general comments or answer questions as you choose in your final remarks.
Well, wow. I mean, it's been a discussion that put down the works. It's I'm not going to try to comment on everything that has been said, because that would be impossible. I shall just try to pick a few issues at random that I consider that I have something to say. First, about Silverman's creeping fascism. I think there is a lot of discussion that has to be done on how do we define things and what sort of descriptions we use. I mean, we could use, I can accept using creeping fascism as a description and as a way of saying what is going on. But the problem starts if we see creeping fascism as a category, which we give it specific characteristics. And this also, it's happening on a more general basis. What is fascism? What is Nazism? If we start using them loosely, we run the danger of diminishing the understanding of the people of what they are. That's the danger that I can see. So creeping fascism, I don't see it as a category, and I wouldn't accept it as a different, as a valid way of putting things. Now, what are these dictators? I'm not sure, and I don't think we have a uniform characteristics enough to put them into the same category. Each country, each situation has its own peculiarities, but this epoch has one important common thing, that these are the result of the crisis of modern capitalism, which gives different forms in different countries. This takes me also to another of Roger's points of countries with no large working class. This also, it's something that we should be careful, because I think we need a discussion of the working class in the West and in the advanced capitalist countries. How does a working class form? How its consciousness is formed? And from this basis, how do we define working class, and who are going to make the revolution in countries like Britain or the United States? This is an interesting discussion. I don't want to go into it now, but I think we shouldn't transfer the responsibility for revolution in the countries with large working class in the sense of India or China or whatever. I think that's a bit dangerous. Dangerous because capitalism, as I said, I think is international capitalism. It's not each country by itself, and anything that happens in one country reflects immediately to the rest of the world, and this is very, very, very important. I also was intrigued by Ed Popper's reference to Poland and putting the miners as the main obstacle to the government. I think this is important, but it also should be taken carefully, in the sense that they might be playing a similar role to the miners in Britain back in the Thatcher days. And if this is the case, it's something that we should take into account. We shouldn't base our hope that the miners can make it in the next period as the foremost troops of the working class, unless there is an international movement of the working class that could use such struggles in taking power. David Henson mentioned the turn of Turkey away from the West and Europe. I would be careful there as well. I don't think Turkey is turning away from Western Europe. Actually, it's taking on Europe and the West on their own turf, and I think they are fighting for a position there, and not for breaking away from the West and going with Russia and the Arab countries and Iran. So this is more of a European and Western field that we are talking about, and that's how we should see Turkey, I think. And as far as Turkey's enormous left-wing movement, yes, it has been one of the most militant left-wing movements we ever saw. I mean, they were probably the only people who they continued demonstrating on the 1st of May in Istanbul with the International and with communist banners and giving and fighting the police. They are nowhere to be seen now. Nowhere, literally nowhere. I think that their demise is mostly a result of their dogmatism and the dogmatic approach to what was happening, and the keeping to their traditions so closely that they failed to see that the game was changing in Turkey itself. So this gave the opportunity to the authorities to really crush them, and the Turkish authorities really crushed people. I mean, we were not talking about normal police situation. Not even Greece couldn't do that. I mean, the Turkish state was much more effective in this. The recreation of the nation state. Again, there, I think that the nation state is dead. It's not what it used to be. What it is there and what we see as a revival, I think is the use by international capital of the forms of the state to suppress discontent and suppress the working class in each country separately, keep the workers separated. But this has nothing to do with the development of capitalism. We see no real national competition within capitalism now. I mean, we see a complete domination of the very, very big companies and the very, very strong countries. Now, whatever clash there is between the West and Turkey and Russia, the West and Russia and China is another matter. But this is not the national state as we used to see it. And one side issue is the lynchings, the issue brought up by the lynchings mentioned by John Ryman. I think, again, we should be careful. We should not judge a society by today's standards. What happened then, it is not only explicable, it is also understandable, not as a moral issue, but as a result of social condition and social consciousness. You cannot really tell the Athenians that they were fascists because they had slaves. That was the society had, that was their thinking. You cannot tell the early Americans that slavery was despicable and stop it there. That was their life. That was how society worked, and we should understand it, and we should really cherish the heroes that fought against slavery in those days. But we cannot really say that it was a barbarous society. That is barbarous by our own standards. There were people that fought against slavery who were not themselves saints. And this is something that we should be careful. We should judge its age on its own standards and criticize them for what they were, yes, but not just condemn the people for that. It's a different issue altogether. Thank you very much for all for a fantastic discussion. I mean, I really enjoyed all the issues that were raised, and I am sorry that we don't have time to tackle every issue that propped up in the discussion. Thank you very much.